Hello and welcome to the Discover History YouTube channel, and today we're talking all things Roman. Yes, I'm afraid so. We've gone back to Rome. I know when we came back from Hadrian's Wall we said we'll give the Romans a break. However, it's a rather difficult thing to do, and the reason for that really is they made a huge impact on Britain, or as they called it at the time, Britannia. So we're going to look at today the items that they had on the table. In other words, tableware. And it's interesting because a lot of pottery items, or even metal items in fact, can be categorized into two. Some people say there's kitchenware or cookware, and then people also say then there is the dining ware, or in particular the tableware. So we're looking at tableware, not cookware. And the interesting thing is, if you turn back the clock to the time of the Roman Empire, they made use of nature. So most of the items for the table could be made out of wood, wooden beakers, wooden plates, wooden spoons even. Very traditional, it's been around for a long time really. They also made use of things like cow's horn, which is, like I said, the plastic that nature gives you that we should technically be using more of. And then we've also got metal, and obviously the Romans used a lot of ironware. They also made use of things like pewter, and then the more precious metals, things like gold and silver. So depending on your status in life, you may have a plate made of silver, you may have a goblet made out of gold, for example. However, for most people, and we're not talking about really lower classes here, for most people the tableware was usually made of pottery, in other words made of clay, and it is quite distinguishable when you find it in the archaeological records. So if you're out walking, for example, and you find some pottery, it is usually quite easy to recognise in comparison with medieval, for example. Medieval pottery, there's that many different types. It is a bit of a mind-blowing exercise when you have a big pile of medieval pottery, shall we say. So if you were a Roman and you had just cooked yourself a meal, or maybe you have people within your household that does the cooking for you, or maybe you've bought a takeaway, because what you have to remember about the Roman period is there was a lot of takeaway shops. And a perfect example of this is if you ever look at Pompeii, for example, there were several takeaway shops there, and most of those you just collect your food and take it home with you to eat. It is also interesting that if you go to Italy or Rome itself, the motherland, the base for the Roman Empire, they often had insulae living. In other words, people lived in blocks of flats, and in that case the Romans actually made a lot of laws and a lot of rules about cooking in your home. Actually, you were not allowed to cook in your home. It was too dangerous, because you had people living above, people living downstairs, people next door. Blocks of flats are not a new thing. We had them as far back as the Roman period. Anyway, let's imagine it's Britain though, and you're about to tuck into a meal. If you're not using native wooden items, you will use pottery. Pottery was really common long ago. Main reason for it, it was relatively easy to make. And the other interesting fact is when you get to the Roman era, most pottery is actually made on a wheel, whereas if you think of Iron Age people or people before that, it tended to be either a pinch pot. In other words, you get the clay and you manipulate it into sides to create a container, or it was coil made. In other words, you take long sausage rolls of clay and then you coil them around like a snake, and that's something a lot of children do in classrooms up and down the country with self-hardening clay. However, these items I'm going to show you were made on a wheel in that new standard Roman way. So this is the type of everyday tableware. So this is a very deep plate, or some people would say a shallow bowl. There are many different types of these, but it's relatively basic. It's made out of local clay. The clay can come in many colours. Sometimes you get grey, sometimes you get a very dark, almost black colour, or you get this, what is often referred to as a terracotta colour. Some of them are extremely plain, some have a slight bit of decoration, as you can see on there. And the good thing about a lot of Roman pottery is a lot of them are actually stamped, and you often find a wooden stamp pushed into the clay prior to firing, that is, that will designate the maker. Now, there are some very clever people in Britain in the archaeological world, and they are cataloguing most of those signs, and it's quite interesting now. They're building up a huge database and they're trying to work out where a lot of the pottery came from, and it's surprising how many potters were working in Britain creating what is often termed as local ware, using local clay and local sand and so on to throw into it to harden the clay. And their wares tend to get purchased not just in the locality, but people are obviously passing through buying it and taking it away with them, because in some cases the maker, in where we think the maker was from, was actually selling his wares for over a huge area, miles, hundreds, 200 miles for example. But as you can see, it's pretty plain stuff. It has no glaze on it, and when it's broken open and you look at the inside, the makeup of it, you often get imperfections in it. You often get things thrown into it to help the hardening of the clay, to make it strong, and therefore you might find tiny little shiny pieces of grit in sand inside it, really. But that's a fine piece of everyday tableware, as used by the Romans to eat their food. And also from the Britons, we did take up many of the ideas that the Romans had. As I said, some are more decorative than others, and this one is a little bit more complicated, as you can see. But you can also find that a lot of this basic tableware is pretty rough to touch. And whenever we do an archaeological workshop, you have to remember all this week is the Festival of Archaeology, it is pretty rough, and we always tell children, when you're writing down what you have found in archaeology, like the workshops that we offer, we always tell people, write down the colour. Is it smooth? Is it rough to touch? When it's broken open, can you actually see if there's any grit in it? These are the things that help archaeologists identify archaeology. The other best thing about pottery is when you find it, along with, for example, animal bone in archaeology, that allows you to date it, because pottery is fantastic stuff for dating. Anyway, when you look at high status people, and like I said, we're not talking about the very high status here. We're not talking about, for example, the emperor, who would obviously have silver platters, silver goblets, or even pewterware. When you're looking at the rich, not the royalty as such, but when you're looking at the rich in Roman terms, their basic pottery, or their fine status pottery is actually something known as Samian ware. And you hear it thrown around all the time. Oh, Samian ware, must be a rich person. Well, generally it was high status. When you look at the end of the empire, however, in the 5th century, it seemed to be more common than ever before. But the best thing about Samian ware is it is very noticeable. You can identify it straight away. It's usually a very red clay colour, and that's because this was clay that was technically not made in Britain. This was generally imported. Saying that, we do know some Samian ware was made in the area of Colchester, only for a short period though, interestingly. Most of it was imported, and it came from the centre or the southern parts of Gaul, in other words, France. And I always describe it, when you look at the two together, we've got everyday wear, which is quite clunky, the equivalent of something you'd buy in a supermarket. For example, you'd buy 6 plates, 6 side plates, 6 bowls. Whereas Samian ware is your bone china, and you can hear it really. This is Samian ware. So it's got a ring to it, basically. And when you tap, for example, everyday wear, it doesn't really have that noise. It's much more of a thud. It's slightly different, and that's really down to the coarseness of the clay that's in it. The other fantastic fact about Samian ware is, even though the plain ones are made on a wheel, like I said, the new Roman way, some of the Samian ware was actually made in a mould, and by making it in a mould, you do actually get the fine decoration that we see going around the edge. This has got a collection of flowers, for example, and you've also got at the bottom some amphora running around the bottom. And obviously this was carved wood, and you use that mould to create beautiful decorations. Some have chariots on, some even have gladiators fighting on it. So that is your Samian ware. And Samian ware was used not just for plates and bowls, it could also be used for cups, like this fine quality Samian cup there to drink your wine out of. But some of the more high status Roman tableware also consisted of glassware. And here we have another replica of some Roman glassware. Some of it was plain, and it's usually very green in colour because they haven't perfected pure glass. You often find that they have bubbles in it. You'll always find bubbles in old glass. And the other interesting thing is this could also be blown into, the glass was often blown into a mould, thereby creating decorative features running around the edge, like this one. But like I said, this really does go to show a person of great importance, especially in the 1st and 2nd centuries, for example, the time of the conquest of Britain. When it came to things to eat with, no one really used a fork as such, not for a very long time. So really the only 2 items that were required was a knife. There we go, that's your standard Roman knife. Came in many different sizes, which could also be used as a fork really, so you're spearing the food on your plate and bringing it up to your mouth. But my favourite has to be the Roman spoon. These could be made out of iron, but most of them were made out of bronze, like this one here. And the Romans are generally having things that are not just used in one way, so these items would often be used in multiple ways. So you have the spoon for scooping up the food, you have the spiked handle, which could also be used for taking snails out of their shell, or for literally acting as a fork to pick up meat, for example. And then the bit that often is incorrectly described as a bottle opener is actually very useful for cracking open shellfish. You can actually open them up and then scoop out the contents to eat afterwards really. So the Romans were very, very clever people, and the best thing I find about dining in Roman terms, and a lot of people will be shouting at me now, is Romans would lounge about to eat. In other words, they would recline, they would lie on cushions, for example, on these large couches, and then have very low tables with a collection of food on. Whereas today we tend to plate up a food and eat it from the plate. Most of the time it was more like a buffet, so several different dishes would be brought onto the low table, and then people would sit down and dine in it, eating them slowly and having a bit of a pick from that plate, one from that bowl and some from that bowl. But like I said, the Romans did use multiple things: wood, cow's horn, pewter. They also used things like bronze and gold and silver. So really it depends on your status. But when it came to tableware in the terms of pottery, like I said, we have the more basic pottery, and then we get the fine quality, and I mean really fine quality, items like Samian ware. But what we must not forget is Samian ware was really high status when it first came here, 1st, 2nd centuries AD, and then towards the end of the empire in the 5th century it was probably more common. You probably would have seen it more dotted around it in many households. Even some of the Iron Age towns and settlements would have been using it, because what you have to remember is a lot of the Britons did actually embrace Roman living more than fight them. I know that's the case with the Dubuni, the local tribe to Worcestershire. When it came to identifying Samian ware though, look out for the red colour. That's always a good giveaway. And inside, when you look at the crack on the inside, it is often very, very clean. In other words, it hasn't got lots of grit and sand in it. It's usually quite a creamy colour texture on the cracked inside. Anyway, on that note, hope you've enjoyed our little look at tableware. Maybe you want to see some cookware, maybe Anglo-Saxon cookware or medieval cookware, or maybe even medieval tableware. The choice is yours. Make sure you subscribe, and remember, this month is July. It's named after, you guessed it, Julius Caesar. On that note, enjoy the sunshine, and we'll see you soon. Bye bye.